Welcome back to our study of Daniel 1 to 6. Now, last week, if you'll remember, we saw the last of our dear friend, old King Nebi. He was turned into this strange creature. He lived in the woods for a while and then finally figured out God is bigger than me. Well, this week, we are learning about a new king in Babylon, and that is our new friend, King Belshazzar. Now, here's something important to note. Like all the Bible, what we have in Daniel is selective. It means that Daniel, as he was putting this together, only chose certain events over a certain amount of time. Daniel was in Babylon for decades, but he only gives us 6 stories. And one of these stories in chapter 5 comes a great deal after the last story. This is about 20 years or so after King Nebuchadnezzar has ended his reign. And in the meantime, there's a whole bunch of coups, a whole bunch of people backstab, take over, assassinate, what have you. Finally, we get to our friend here, King Belshazzar. Now, King Belshazzar is now ruling Babylon. And like Nebuchadnezzar, has a lot to look back on in Babylonian history. Now, surely he's known about Daniel and his friends, these great wise men who advised King Nebuchadnezzar in many matters, and have heard from all sorts of folks the wonderful things they did, and they claimed it was because of this Most High God, or this God of the heavens. Well, Belshazzar hasn't quite gotten that message. And so we're going to turn to chapter 5, verse 1, and see what he's up to. King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine in their presence. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar gave orders to bring in the gold and silver vessels that his predecessor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines could drink from them. So they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple, the house of God, Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, wives, and concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised their gods, made of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone. So what's going on here? First of all, Belshazzar's having a big old party. Belshazzar invites 1,000 of his nobles, and he brings out the wine, and he's not just in some upper room with a few advisors. He's not just sticking his face out there to make appearances. No, Belshazzar is just in there mingling with all these folks. Which, on one hand, is good leadership. You want a leader who actually knows the people who are looking to him for leadership. But also, Belshazzar's just wandering around this giant crowd, drinking quite a bit of wine. His senses aren't quite with him anymore. And he's going to end up doing some pretty stupid stuff. The first stupid thing he does is he says, hey, all those things Nebuchadnezzar took from that temple in Jerusalem, bring them out. Let's start drinking out of them. A very bad idea. Now remember, God allowed these things to be taken from the temple because the temple and these things in the temple weren't what Israel was supposed to look to. They were supposed to look towards God himself. But they looked towards the temple, they looked towards kings, they looked towards these physical, earthly things, and they thought those things would keep them safe. And so God allows them to be taken from Jerusalem, allows their king to be captured, because the Israelites need to know, as they're spending this time in exile, it's God we look to, not any earthly thing. And remember, the two big questions in Daniel are, where is God? How do we live in exile? Well, God's still up there in heaven. And there is a reference that should be associated with these things from God's temple because he wanted them to be put there in the first place. Now King Belshazzar takes them out and treats them like toys to play with, to drink out of. And look in verse 4. They drank their wine and then they praised their gods. They took what was to be used to worship the one true God from his temple. They drank wine out of it. They got drunk. And then they praised their gods made of all these fake temporary things. They build a god, they build a statue, and they worship to it. It's ridiculous, it's pitiful, it's sad, and it's certainly not something that is pleasing to God. So look at verse 5. At that moment, the fingers of a man's hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the king's palace wall next to the lampstand. So all of a sudden, right there, they're all hanging out together, getting drunk, doing some gross stuff as well. We're not going to get into that. And then all of a sudden, a hand appears on the wall and starts writing. That's very bizarre. Now, here's something we know as people who can read the whole Bible and as people who aren't, like Belshazzar, totally ignorant of the scriptures. The only other time we really see a hand like this in the Bible so far is when God writes the Ten Commandments, a summary of his law for his people on these tablets of stone that he gives to Moses. And so immediately Christian readers, immediately Jewish readers are going to know this hand that's writing on the wall, this is the same hand that wrote the law for how God's people are to live. And so God shows up here in the middle of this party. As the king watched the hand that was writing, his face turned pale, and his thoughts so terrified him that he soiled himself and his knees knocked together. This is the king, right? King Belshazzar. He's so relaxed, he thinks he's doing so well, he's just going to have a drunken party and invite everybody who's important in the kingdom to come. All of a sudden, a hand appears, starts writing on the wall. He gets so scared, he turns as white as his paper, he pees himself, and his knees are knocking because he is so afraid. This is the king? The king shouted to bring in the mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. He said to these wise men of Babylon, whoever can read this inscription and gives me its interpretation will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around his neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom. So all the king's wise men came in, and given everything we cited in Daniel so far, what do you think is going to happen? Are they going to be able to understand what God's hand is writing on the wall? Of course not. So all the king's wise men came in, but none could read the inscription or make its interpretation known to him. Then King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face turned pale, and his nobles were bewildered. Right, so now he's even paler. He's gone from like this color right here to now you just can't see Belshazzar. He is translucent. Okay, he is so afraid. And his nobles were bewildered. Now, gasp, awkward silence. Everybody stopped. Now everybody's probably peed themselves, terrified that God has just written on their wall and they don't know what he's saying to them. It's a bad place to be. Verse 10, because of the outcry of the king and his nobles, the queen came to the banquet hall. May the king live forever, she said. Don't let your thoughts terrify you or your face be pale. Oh, late for that, ma'am. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the days of your predecessor, he was found to have insight, intelligence, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. Your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, mediums, Chaldeans, and diviners. He did this, the king, because Daniel, the one the king named Belshazzar, was found to have an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and intelligence, the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems. Therefore summon Daniel, and he will give the interpretation. Here's a fun fact for you. It has now been decades since Daniel arrived in Babylon, which is why, although it's very small, we're calling your boy Daniel a very smart old fart. I like to think of it this way. So King Nebuchadnezzar dies. Maybe Daniel's hanging around there for a couple more kings after that. We don't really know. We just know at this point, Daniel's not part of the king's court anymore. Now, King Belshazzar either didn't know much about this Daniel guy or didn't care. He gets in office, he kills some guy, sits in his throne, and doesn't think to like read his notes or ask his advisors, hey, what's the last guy been doing up here? But the queen, who's possibly his mother, not his wife, the queen comes and says, hey, have you heard about this guy Daniel, who's probably hanging out on Cracker Barrel in one of those rocking chairs out front right now, just peacefully enjoying his retirement because this king didn't want him, and Daniel doesn't really need to be there. Daniel's worked, he's worked hard. Now I'd like to think he's off enjoying his retirement. But he's still a very smart old fart, and it's not because there's anything special about Daniel. You know the cool thing about Daniel? All the stories in Daniel take place when Daniel and his friends are teenagers, or when Daniel's a very old man. Now there's nothing wrong with being a teenager or an old man, but what God is showing us through this is it doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what state of life you're in, what kind of influence you have. If you're faithful to God, He can use you in powerful ways. And so, given everything we've seen so far in Daniel, we know that when the queen says, "Go call Daniel," something good is probably going to happen. Then Daniel was brought before the king. Now, look, this is Belshazzar. Belshazzar, who was so afraid, he peed himself, his knees knocked together, he turned so pale you couldn't even see him anymore. And finally, Daniel, the one man in all of the kingdom who might have the answer to this problem, he calls in Daniel, and Daniel comes out of retirement. No obligation of Daniel to be there, yet he comes anyways. Now, if you're King Belshazzar, you'd want to butter this guy up. You'd want to be very nice to him. You want to say, "Daniel, thank God you are here. I heard about all this stuff you did for King Nebuchadnezzar, and look at that on the wall. Can you please help us with this? I'll give you anything you want. Just tell us what it means." This is what Belshazzar says instead. "Are you Daniel, one of the Judean exiles that my predecessor brought back from Judah?" I like the way Pastor Alistair Begg explained this. He says, Belshazzar basically said to him, "Are you one of those trash that Nebuchadnezzar hauled in from Judah?" So not, "Are you the great advisor of King Nebuchadnezzar? Are you the wise man?" No, he says, "You one of those trash people from Judah? I've heard that you have a spirit of the gods in you, and that wisdom and that insight, intelligence, and extraordinary wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men and mediums were brought before me to read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not give its interpretation." And Daniel's sitting there, stroking his very long beard, scratching his bald head, thinking, "Sounds about right. Done this dance before. However, I've heard about you and that you can give interpretations and solve problems." Okay. So he's like, "Hey, you're one of those trash from Judah. Come over here. Look, some people have told me you're a pretty sharp guy. You can solve problems. These other guys couldn't do it." Belshazzar should be a lot more humble. Remember, chapter 4 ends with Nebuchadnezzar saying, "God is able to humble those who walk in pride." Here's Belshazzar, pee still in his pants, hasn't recovered from this writing on the wall, and is acting like a pompous jerk. "Therefore, if you can read this inscription and give me its interpretation, you'll be clothed in purple, have a gold chain around your neck, and have the third highest position in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts and give your rewards to someone else." Daniel doesn't need them. Especially since he's now in retirement, he's enjoying all of his labors for decades, faithfully serving the Lord in the court of Babylon. He doesn't need any of this stuff, and he's not doing anything for the rewards. He's doing whatever he does because while he's in exile, remember, he strived to be faithful to God no matter what the cost. "Your Majesty, the Most High God gave sovereignty, greatness, glory, and majesty to your predecessor, King Nebuchadnezzar. Because of the greatness he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages were terrified and fearful of him. He killed anyone he wanted and kept anyone alive he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and humbled anyone he wanted." Now here's something really cool, is that Nebuchadnezzar, we mostly see him in Daniel, but he's alluded to and mentioned in some other books of the Bible. Before the Israelites were sent into exile, they had these guys, the prophets, who warned them, "Guys, you need to stop sinning or God's going to cast you out of the promised land and make you be slaves of another people." They didn't listen. But when the prophets were saying that, they were saying, God's going to use this king as a tool of discipline to take you into some strange land to punish you so that you'll remember who God is and strive to be faithful to him. And so for God, Nebuchadnezzar was a tool to be used the way he desired. So look at verse 20. "When his heart was exalted and his spirit became arrogant, he was deposed of his royal throne and his glory taken from him." So when Nebuchadnezzar stopped ruling the way God wanted him to rule, God took him off the throne. Remember, he's this guy hanging out in the woods for a while. He was driven away from people. His mind was like an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like a cattle. And his body was drenched with dew from the sky, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is ruler over human kingdoms and set anyone he wants over them. But you, his successor, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. Somehow or another, Belshazzar was expected to know. Now, maybe Belshazzar comes and sits in this throne and sees the servant of the last king and doesn't bother to ask him, hey, what's going on here? But these things that happened to the king of the whole world. They would have been public. Everybody knew in the court what had happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. Belshazzar's without excuse. To put it into our terms, we have a whole big book, the Bible, of what God has been doing in human history for thousands of years. We can read it, we can learn about it. You listening, you're doing that right now. Learning about what God has already done, just like Belshazzar was supposed to. But Belshazzar didn't take that opportunity that God gave to him. Instead, verse 23, you have exalted yourself against the Lord of heavens. The vessels from his house were brought to you, and you drank, and your nobles, wives, and concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods made of silver and gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which you don't see or hear or understand. So he took these things from the one true God, drunk wine out of them, and then praised gods who can't speak to him, who can't do anything because they're not real. It's like bowing down to the microphone in front of me. It can't do anything. It's not real. What an insult to God. You have not glorified the God who holds your life breath in his hand, who controls the whole course of your life. Therefore, he sent the hand, and this writing was inscribed. Belshazzar has no excuses. Daniel says he holds your life breath in his hand. He directs the whole course of your life. Simply by Belshazzar being alive, he's without excuse. Like Nebuchadnezzar, he should have figured out by now, God is bigger than me and I need to turn to him. And yet he didn't. So God sent the hand, verse 25. This is the writing that was inscribed. Many, many tekel and parson. This is the interpretation of the message. Mene means that God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel means that you have been weighed on the balance and found deficient. Paris means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. So let's go back over this. First of all, Mene, it's repeated twice. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. That means that Belshazzar's kingdom is about to be destroyed, about to be taken from him. Tekel means that he's been weighed on the balance and found deficient. The idea here is of a scale, right? And as king, Belshazzar had to live up to God's standards, and he was weighed, and he was found to be too light. He wasn't good. He wasn't ruling the way God would have him to rule, and looking up to God and saying, "I am your instrument, God. Use me how you will." Paris means that your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And that's what's about to happen, that there is no kingdom of Babylon in just a few verses from now. Verse 29, then Belshazzar gave an order, and they clothed Daniel in purple, placed a gold chain around his neck, and issued a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now you got to give Belshazzar this. He hears this message, and he does at least stay faithful to his word that I'll reward whoever tells me what it means. You know what Belshazzar doesn't do? He doesn't turn to God. In fact, we're going to see in a couple verses. This is the only chapter so far in Daniel that hasn't ended with the king saying something in praise of God or something true about God. Belshazzar hears this, and yet he still doesn't turn to God. So verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of 62. So here's what happens. Belshazzar hears this message. God is bigger than you. He's greater than you. You were supposed to turn to him. You had no excuse, yet you didn't. And now your kingdom's going to be destroyed. And that very night it is. Here's what happens. We know from secular history. Essentially, Belshazzar had this big party. And it seems like he was a little bit lax on the defense of the city at that time, because a whole new nation brings their army up through the sewers under the city. They come in and kill Belshazzar and take over the kingdom. And now there is no kingdom of Babylon, it's now the Medo-Persian kingdom. And Belshazzar's life comes to an end with him still not acknowledging God. Now, we saw last time in chapter 4, God gave Nebuchadnezzar a whole lot of chances, again and again, for years and for years. And God certainly does that in a lot of ways to us, and even did it for Belshazzar, giving him years ruling before God wiped him out, and even writing that hand. It's very possible if Belshazzar repented and said, Lord, I haven't ruled the way you would have me to rule. I need to turn to you and humble myself before you. Maybe God would have spared Belshazzar. That's not what happened. Belshazzar went to his grave that very night thinking, I'm bigger than God. You know what? He wasn't. So our two big questions: where is God? God's in heaven, and he is looking down over us, and he is bigger than us, and he's greater than us. He holds our life breath in his hand. He directs the whole course of our lives. And it's not because God is some wicked person pulling us along like puppets, waiting to throw us into hell. No, it's because God loves us and wants us to turn to him. And so how do we live in exile? How do we live in this world surrounded by evil, by sin, by wickedness, by all sorts of distractions? We're supposed to, like Nebuchadnezzar did and Belshazzar didn't, like Daniel resolved to from the first moment his foot set on the ground in Babylon, we have to resolve to turn to God and say, you are God, I am not. We have to turn from our sins and say, God, forgive me for everything wrong I've done against you. Help me to live in a way that's right before you. And we can do all these things not because God thinks we're just so cute, not because God's going to say, oh, he's sorry. Hopefully he won't do it again and just brush our sin aside. No, the only way we can do this is a sinless Savior, Jesus, who came and died for us. And when we turn to him, we are part of a kingdom that, unlike Belshazzar's, unlike Nebuchadnezzar's, unlike the United States or Russia, will never end. And so, our application, as it always is in Daniel, trust God, be faithful, no matter what, because he's got you if you'll only turn to him. And so turn to Jesus, like Belshazzar didn't, like Daniel did.